I was hired to kill the most dangerous man in the city, but no one warned me that he was already hunting me. The rain blurred the Manhattan skyline into streaks of gold and gray as I stood on the rooftop across the street, the cold wind tugging at the edge of my coat, while traffic moved below like restless rivers of light. Midnight in this city never really slept, it only changed tempo, and tonight the rhythm felt different, slower, like the city itself was holding its breath. My name is Scarlet Hayes, though very few people know it, and even fewer live long enough to remember it. Most people in my line of work don't leave stories behind, only unfinished questions. 48 hours earlier a message had arrived through a secure channel used only for the kind of contracts that change lives. One line, one name, Adrian Volkov. The payment attached to that name was $10 million, wired in advance to prove the offer was real. In my world, numbers like that meant only one thing. The target mattered. A lot. I had heard the rumors long before I accepted the contract. Adrian Volkov controlled half the underground business that moved quietly beneath Manhattan's polished skyline. Some called him a criminal mastermind. Others called him a businessman with unconventional methods. Either way, people who crossed him had a strange habit of disappearing from conversations, from cities, sometimes from history itself. Tonight he was attending a private gathering inside the glass tower across the avenue, 23 floors up, surrounded by people who believed expensive suits and security guards could make them untouchable. From my vantage point, I could see the reflection of the party lights in the massive windows, silhouettes moving behind the glass, laughter rising faintly through the storm. I checked my watch. 12:23 a.m. Adrian Volkov was late. Powerful men often were. They liked to make an entrance. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and distant traffic, and for a moment I felt the strange calm that comes before a mission begins. Most people assume my work is driven by adrenaline or anger. It isn't. It's precision, observation, waiting for the exact moment when a story reaches its turning point. My eyes moved across the building again, scanning exits, cameras, reflections. That's when something unusual caught my attention. The elevator doors opened in. The lobby far below, visible through the towering glass facade. A tall figure stepped out, moving with quiet confidence, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had never needed to hurry for anyone in his life. Even from 23 floors above, I knew immediately who it was. Adrian Volkov had arrived. Dark suit, deliberate stride, the kind of presence that shifted the room before he even spoke. But what happened next made the quiet night tighten around me. Adrian stopped halfway across the lobby and slowly turned his head toward the windows, toward the rooftops beyond them, toward the darkness where I stood watching. The distance between us was more than 100 yards of rain and glass. Yet something about the moment felt uncomfortably direct. His gaze didn't wander across the skyline, like someone admiring the view. It paused, focused, searching. Then, almost casually, Adrian Volkov reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and spoke a few quiet words to someone on the other end. Seconds later, 3 security guards inside the lobby began scanning the rooftops across the street. My rooftop. A slow realization settled into my chest like cold air. This wasn't going according to plan. Because the man I had come here to hunt wasn't acting like prey at all. He was acting like a man who already knew the hunter was watching. I did not move for 3 full seconds after the guards began scanning the rooftops. 3 seconds is a long time when someone might already know you are there. Rain tapped steadily against the metal railing beside me, while the wind carried the distant sound of a taxi horn echoing between the buildings. My pulse stayed calm, steady, controlled. Panic gets people caught. Observation keeps them alive. Down in the glass lobby, Adrian Volkov ended his phone call and slipped the device back into his pocket like a man who had just confirmed something he already suspected. The guards spread out across the lobby floor, speaking quietly into their earpieces while their eyes moved upward toward the skyline, toward the dark shapes of rooftops where someone like me would choose to watch from. The unsettling part was not that they were looking. It was how quickly they had started looking. That meant one thing. Adrian Volkov had not guessed. He had known. I lowered myself slowly behind the rooftop ventilation unit, letting the shadows swallow my outline while I studied the man through the scope of my binoculars. Even from this distance, the calm confidence in his posture was unmistakable. Most powerful men surround themselves with security because they fear what might happen without it. Adrian Volkov carried himself like someone who believed danger was simply another meeting he had already scheduled. The elevator doors opened behind him, and several guests stepped into the lobby, laughing as they prepared to leave the party upstairs. Adrian barely glanced at them. His attention remained fixed on the glass windows and the darkness beyond them. On the rooftops. On me. I had studied hundreds of targets in my career. Politicians who checked their watches every 10 seconds. Business executives who never looked up from their phones. Men who believed wealth made them invisible. Adrian Volkov was none of those things. He was watching the night the way a hunter studies a forest, patient and alert, waiting for movement that most people would never notice. A quiet thought slipped through my mind, cold and clear. This contract was different. The rain grew heavier, streaking across the glass tower like silver lines while the city lights blurred into glowing halos below. One of the guards stepped outside the building and moved toward the curb, scanning the opposite rooftops with deliberate care. If I stayed here much longer, the angle would eventually reveal me. So I did what people rarely expect. I stepped back from the edge of the roof. The binoculars lowered. My breath slowed as I turned toward the stairwell door behind me. Sometimes the smartest move in a hunt is not pulling the trigger. It is disappearing before the other predator confirms your position. As I pushed open the metal door and slipped into the dim stairwell, the echo of the city faded into distant murmurs. Concrete walls. Flickering fluorescent lights. The quiet smell of rain carried in on my coat. I began descending the stairs without hurry, my footsteps soft against the metal steps while the plan in my head quietly rearranged itself. Adrian Volkov had looked directly toward my rooftop. He had alerted his guards in less than 10 seconds. That meant his instincts were sharp, his awareness sharper. The kind of awareness that only comes from experience. The kind that usually belongs to people who have survived more than one hunt. By the time I reached the ground floor and stepped out into the rain-soaked alley behind the building, the cold realization had fully settled in. I had accepted a contract to hunt the most dangerous man in Manhattan. What no one had mentioned in the message was the other half of the equation. Adrian Volkov was not waiting to be hunted. He was already searching for the assassin who had come for him. I did not go home that night. People in my profession rarely do after the first contact with a target like Adrian Volkov. Instead, I walked 3 blocks through the rain and entered a small 24-hour diner on Lexington Avenue where the neon sign flickered like a tired heartbeat above the door. Places like this are perfect for observation. Nobody remembers the quiet person in the corner booth drinking black coffee while the city moves around them. The waitress placed a mug in front of me and I wrapped my hands around it, letting the warmth steady my thoughts while the storm rattled softly against the windows. Midnight had turned into 1:30 in the morning and Manhattan had shifted into its late-night rhythm. Taxi headlights glided past the glass. A couple argued quietly at the counter. Somewhere a radio played an old jazz song that sounded like it had been drifting through this diner for 20 years. I opened the thin laptop inside my bag and began searching everything I could about Adrian Volkov again, even though I had already memorized most of it before accepting the contract. 32 years old. Owner of several import companies, known for hosting exclusive events that attracted investors, politicians, and men whose wealth never appeared on official records. Rumors suggested his real power existed in places the law rarely reached. What bothered me was not the information. It was the gaps. Entire sections of his past seemed to vanish before he arrived in New York almost a decade ago. People who become powerful usually leave a trail behind them. Adrian Volkov had somehow erased most of his. I stared at his photo on the screen. Dark hair, calm expression, eyes that looked like they were always measuring something just beyond the camera. A man like that does not survive in the shadows by accident. The bell above the diner door chimed softly and a cold gust of rain swept across the floor. Instinct made me glance toward the entrance. A tall figure stepped inside and shook the water from his coat before scanning the room with quiet precision. My hand froze around the coffee mug. Adrian Volkov. For a moment, the noise of the diner seemed to fade into the background. He moved toward the counter with unhurried confidence, as if this was simply another stop during an ordinary night. No guards. No security detail. Just the most powerful man in the city walking into a place where truck drivers and night shift nurses stopped for pie and coffee. The waitress greeted him like she had seen him before. He nodded politely, and ordered coffee in a voice calm enough that nobody in the room looked twice. Except me. I lowered my gaze to the laptop screen, pretending to read while my mind raced through possibilities. Either this was a coincidence, so unlikely it bordered on impossible, or Adrian Volkov had followed a trail straight to the diner. I listened carefully as he stirred sugar into his coffee behind me. The quiet clink of the spoon against ceramic echoed louder than it should have. Then his voice spoke from only a few feet away, smooth and unhurried. Interesting choice of location for someone who prefers rooftops. My eyes lifted slowly from the screen. Adrian Volkov was looking directly at me through the reflection in the diner window. He had not turned around. He did not need to. And in that moment the truth settled into place with perfect clarity. I had spent the night studying the most dangerous man in Manhattan. What I had not realized was that he had been studying me right back. I did not turn around immediately. That was the first rule of survival when someone like Adrian Volkov spoke your presence into the room. React too quickly, and you confirm everything. React too slowly, and you reveal fear. So I took another calm sip of coffee and watched his reflection in the rain-streaked diner window while the neon lights outside painted the glass in shifting colors of red and blue. Adrian remained seated at the counter, one hand resting loosely around his coffee mug as if he were discussing the weather with a stranger rather than confronting the person hired to end his life. The quiet confidence in his posture was unsettling. Most people show tension when they realize a threat is nearby. Adrian looked almost amused. The waitress passed between us carrying a plate of pancakes for another customer, and neither of us spoke until she disappeared into the kitchen again. Only then did Adrian continue in the same calm tone. You know, rooftops usually offer better visibility than diners. Less coffee, though. His reflection finally turned slightly toward mine. Not enough to face me directly. Just enough to show he was watching without appearing to watch. I closed the laptop slowly and slid it back into my bag. The jazz song on the radio drifted through the diner like a slow conversation between old friends while rain continued tapping against the windows. Interesting observation, I said quietly. Adrian took a small sip of his coffee. I try to pay attention to details, especially when someone has been following me across half the city tonight. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them carried the weight of certainty. He had not guessed. He had traced my movements. The thought should have made my pulse rise, but instead it sharpened my focus. If Adrian Volkov had found me this quickly, then the game had already changed. I turned slightly in my booth so I could see him without relying on reflections. Up close he looked exactly like the photographs, but photographs never capture the subtle things that make someone dangerous. The stillness in his eyes. The way his attention seemed to measure every movement in the room without appearing to move at all. He noticed the shift immediately and offered a small polite nod, the kind strangers exchange in quiet places late at night. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Two people sitting 10 feet apart in a diner that smelled like coffee and maple syrup while an entire city slept around us. Finally Adrian set his mug down on the counter and asked a question so calmly it almost sounded casual. How much did they offer you? The question hung in the air between us. I did not answer. Instead, I studied him the same way he had studied the rooftops earlier, searching for signs of impatience or anger. There were none. Adrian Volkov looked like a man discussing business terms rather than his own survival. When I remained silent, he smiled faintly, not mocking, just thoughtful. 10 million would be my guess. That seems to be the current rate for my inconvenience. The accuracy of the number sent a quiet chill down my spine. Adrian noticed the reaction immediately. I see I was correct, he said softly. He lifted his coffee again, watching me over the rim of the mug. Now the interesting question becomes this. He paused just long enough for the rain outside to fill the silence. If you are here, and I am here, then who exactly is watching both of us tonight? Adrian's question settled over the diner like a quiet storm cloud that nobody else in the room seemed to notice. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the rain tapping steadily against the glass. I followed his gaze toward the window, letting my eyes scan the reflections of the street outside. Yellow taxi lights slid across the wet pavement. A delivery truck rolled past slowly. Two pedestrians hurried along the sidewalk under a shared umbrella. Ordinary pieces of the city, or the kind of details people hide inside when they do not want to be noticed. I turned back toward Adrian. You assume someone is watching, I said calmly. Adrian tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the choice of words. I do not assume things, he replied. I observe patterns. And tonight the pattern is wrong. He lifted one finger and gently tapped the ceramic mug in front of him. When a professional hunter takes a contract, they do not reveal themselves inside a diner at 1:30 in the morning. They stay distant, patient, invisible. His eyes moved briefly toward mine through the reflection in the stainless steel coffee machine. Which means something forced you to change the plan. I remained still in the booth, considering the possibilities. The unsettling part was that he was correct. My plan had changed the moment he looked directly toward my rooftop earlier that night. Adrian continued speaking with the same measured tone, like someone explaining a puzzle rather than confronting a threat. And when a plan changes that quickly, it usually means a second variable has entered the situation. His gaze shifted toward the rain-streaked window again. Someone else hunting the same target. Or perhaps hunting the hunter. The idea had already crossed my mind, but hearing it spoken aloud made the quiet tension in the room sharpen. I glanced toward the door of the diner without moving my head fully. The neon sign outside buzzed softly. The street looked almost empty except for the slow-passing traffic. Almost. Across the avenue, a black sedan sat parked along the curb with its headlights off. The car had been there when I arrived. At the time, it seemed like any other vehicle left overnight in the city. Now it looked different. Still, waiting. Adrian noticed the direction of my attention immediately. He did not turn to look. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he stirred his coffee slowly and spoke in a voice quiet enough that only I could hear it from across the room. Black sedan. Parked 20 yards away. Engine idling every few minutes to keep the battery warm in the rain. The driver has been inside for almost 40 minutes. The calm precision of his observation sent a quiet chill down my spine. You have been watching it too, I said. Adrian smiled faintly into his coffee. Of course. When you live long enough in my world, you learn something important. He paused and set the spoon gently against the saucer. The person who hires the hunter often sends another one to make sure the job gets done. The weight of that sentence settled between us. $10 million was a large number, but in certain circles, it was also an investment. One that powerful organizations rarely trusted to a single person. I leaned back slightly in the booth, letting the idea settle into place. So the question is not whether someone else is watching, I said quietly. The question is which one of us they expect to fall first. Adrian finally turned halfway on the stool and looked directly at me for the first time since entering the diner. His eyes were calm, steady, almost curious. That is exactly the question, Scarlet Hayes. Hearing my name spoken so easily sent a ripple of silence through my thoughts. Adrian lifted his mug again and took a slow sip of coffee. And now that we both know we are part of the same hunt, he said softly, the only real question left is whether we keep hunting each other. Or start hunting the people outside. For a few seconds neither of us moved. The diner continued its quiet rhythm around us while the rain outside softened into a steady whisper against the glass. Adrian Volkov sat at the counter with the calm posture of someone who had already accepted every possible outcome of the night. I remained in the booth, watching the reflection of the black sedan across the street through the window beside him. The car had not moved. Its shape remained a dark silhouette beneath the street lamp, rain sliding slowly down the windshield like thin rivers of silver. Adrian set his mug down carefully and slid a few bills across the counter to pay for the coffee. The waitress thanked him without realizing the strange tension that had settled between the two people in her diner. Adrian stood and adjusted his coat with a relaxed movement that looked almost casual. Then he glanced toward the door. We should probably leave before whoever is inside that car decides they are tired of waiting. His tone sounded more like someone suggesting a late-night walk than discussing a potential threat. I closed my bag slowly and stood from the booth. The city outside the window looked ordinary. Wet pavement. Blurred headlights. The kind of quiet street that hides things well. Adrian opened the diner door, and the cool night air swept inside with the scent of rain and distant traffic. We stepped out onto the sidewalk together like two strangers who had simply finished a conversation over coffee. The streetlight above us flickered once as a car passed at the far end of the block. Adrian walked beside me at an unhurried pace, his eyes casually scanning the reflections in storefront windows as we moved. People think danger always announces itself loudly, he said quietly as we walked. But the real kind is patient. It waits for you to believe everything is normal. I kept my gaze forward while watching the black sedan through the reflection in a dark shop window. It was still there, still quiet, still watching. You said the driver has been there 40 minutes, I replied. Adrian nodded slightly, which means they are waiting for confirmation. Either that the contract is complete or that someone else will finish it. The calm certainty in his voice made the situation feel even more surreal. Most people would have left the city by now. Adrian Volkov was strolling down a rain-soaked sidewalk, discussing strategy with the person hired to eliminate him. We reached the corner where the crosswalk signal blinked slowly above the empty intersection. Adrian stopped beside the pole and glanced toward the parked sedan without turning his head fully. Interesting thing about hunters, he said quietly. They usually focus so hard on their target that they forget something important. The light changed from red to green. What is that? I asked. Adrian looked at me directly for the briefest moment. That sometimes the target notices them first. At that exact moment, the engine of the black sedan across the street turned over softly, the headlights flickering to life through the rain. The car began to roll slowly away from the curb, merging into the quiet flow of traffic like it had never been watching at all. Adrian followed its movement with calm interest. Well, he said after a moment, now we know one thing for certain. I watched the taillights disappear down the street, a quiet realization settling into place. What is that? Adrian gave a small, thoughtful smile. The night just became much more complicated for both of us. The taillights of the black sedan disappeared at the far end of the block, swallowed by the quiet rain and the endless flow of late-night traffic. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The crosswalk signal blinked green above us while water gathered along the edges of the sidewalk and streamed slowly toward the storm drains. Adrian stood beside me with the relaxed stillness of someone who had already moved 3 steps ahead in the situation. The strange part was how natural the moment felt. 2 strangers standing under a flickering streetlight in Manhattan at nearly 2 in the morning while the city hummed around them. Except nothing about this night was ordinary. I watched the empty street where the sedan had vanished and felt a quiet shift in the balance of the hunt. Whoever had been inside that car had not expected Adrian and me to walk out of the diner together. That alone changed the rules. Adrian finally stepped forward and began walking again down the wet sidewalk. I matched his pace without thinking. You did not seem surprised, I said after a moment. Adrian glanced toward a storefront window as we passed, studying our reflections the way a chess player studies the board after every move. Surprised is not the right word, he replied calmly. I was hoping they would reveal themselves sooner. I slowed slightly, turning that statement over in my mind. You expected someone else to be involved. Adrian nodded once. Contracts like yours rarely travel alone. People who operate at that level prefer redundancy. If one plan fails, another finishes the job. His tone remained almost conversational, but the meaning behind it was sharp. $10 million was not simply payment. It was leverage, a way to make sure multiple people chased the same result. We reached another intersection where the glow of a convenience store spilled across the pavement. The street here was quieter, the buildings older, their windows dark except for the occasional apartment light flickering in the upper floors. Adrian stopped beside the glass storefront and looked inside as if examining the rows of snacks and bottled drinks. But his eyes were not focused on the shelves. They were watching the reflection of the street behind us. They followed us for almost 5 blocks after you left the rooftop, he said quietly. I noticed them near Madison Avenue. They kept their distance, professional enough to avoid obvious mistakes. I crossed my arms lightly against the cool air and studied the reflection beside him. Nothing unusual appeared on the street. No car idling. No pedestrians lingering. Whoever had been watching earlier had vanished just as smoothly as they appeared. If they lost us, they will look again tomorrow, I said. Adrian turned toward me with that same faint, thoughtful expression. They did not lose us, Scarlett. They simply learned something new tonight. Which is what? Adrian stepped away from the glass and resumed walking, his shoes making soft sounds against the rain-dark pavement. That the assassin they hired did not finish the job when she had the chance, and that the man she was supposed to eliminate is now walking beside her down a public street. The implications settled quietly into place. Anyone observing the situation would reach the same conclusion, that the mission had changed, that loyalties were uncertain. I glanced toward him. So now we both look suspicious. Adrian gave a small, amused breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Suspicion is part of survival in my world. The real question is how long they will wait before adjusting the plan. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the city as we reached the corner of another block. Adrian stopped beneath a streetlight and looked up briefly at the dark skyline above us. When he spoke again, his voice was calm but certain. Because once they adjust the plan, Scarlett, they will not be watching from parked cars anymore. They will start moving pieces across the board. And when that happens, the night will stop being quiet. The rain had slowed to a thin mist that drifted through the glow of the streetlights as Adrian and I continued down the quiet Manhattan block. The city felt strangely calm for a place that usually never stopped moving. Somewhere in the distance, a subway rumbled beneath the pavement, the vibration passing through the ground like a slow heartbeat. Adrian walked beside me with the same controlled pace he had carried since leaving the diner, his eyes occasionally moving toward windows, reflections, and dark intersections, as if he were quietly mapping the entire street in his head. After a few minutes, he turned toward a narrow side street lined with older brick buildings and dim apartment entrances. "This way," he said softly. "Less traffic. Less attention." I followed without argument. The alley opened into a small courtyard behind a row of buildings where a single overhead light flickered weakly above a metal fire escape. Rainwater collected in shallow puddles across the concrete, reflecting the pale glow of the city skyline beyond the rooftops. Adrian stopped near the center of the courtyard and finally turned to face me directly. For the first time since we met in the diner, the conversation between us felt less like a passing encounter and more like the beginning of something complicated. "You are probably wondering how I knew your name," he said calmly. I crossed my arms slightly against the cool air but kept my expression steady. "That question did cross my mind." Adrian nodded once. "The people who hired you belong to an organization that prefers to remain invisible. They recruit quietly. They erase records. They train individuals who are not supposed to exist outside their system." His voice remained low and precise, like someone explaining facts rather than secrets. I watched him carefully. "You are speaking as if you know them well." Adrian looked up briefly toward the fire escape above us, where water dripped steadily from the metal steps. "I do," he said. "Because 10 years ago I worked for them." The statement hung in the quiet courtyard between us. I felt the pieces of the night shift again inside my mind. The rooftop, the sedan watching from the street. The second hunter Adrian had predicted. "You were saying the same people who hired me once controlled you." Adrian gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Controlled is the correct word. They build loyalty through leverage, through information, through fear. But eventually, every system creates someone who learns too much." His eyes returned to mine with calm certainty. I became that person. The idea settled slowly into place. If Adrian had once belonged to the same network that trained people like me, then the contract was not just a random job. It was part of something larger. "So they want you removed before you expose them," I said quietly. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the narrow entrance of the courtyard where the dark street waited beyond the brick walls. Eventually, he spoke again. "They want control restored. Removing me is only one piece of that." The rain continued falling lightly around us, tapping against the metal railings and echoing softly through the alley. I studied Adrian for another moment. The man I had been hired to eliminate now stood in front of me, revealing a connection to the same hidden network that had shaped my entire career. "That changes the contract," I said slowly. Adrian gave a faint, almost amused smile. "Yes, it does. Because now you understand something important." He stepped closer by one quiet pace, his voice still calm, but carrying a new weight beneath it. "The people who hired you are not simply trying to eliminate me tonight. They are testing which side you will stand on when this ends." Adrian's words lingered in the quiet courtyard long after he finished speaking. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving the air cool and still, the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel louder than it should. Water dripped steadily from the metal fire escape above us, tapping against the pavement like a slow clock counting down something neither of us had named yet. I studied Adrian carefully. The calm certainty in his voice suggested he had been expecting this moment long before tonight. If what he said was true, then the contract I accepted was never just about money. It was about allegiance. The realization settled slowly into place, like a door opening in a room I had not realized existed. "You believe they are testing me," I said, Adrian nodded slightly, his gaze steady. They want to know if the person they trained still belongs to them. The city lights reflected faintly in the puddles around our feet, broken into fragments of gold and white by the uneven pavement. I had spent years working inside the invisible system he described, a network that operated through whispers, encrypted messages, and carefully placed instructions. In that world, loyalty was not discussed openly. It was assumed, and anyone who questioned it usually disappeared from the conversation entirely. But Adrian Volkov was standing here after walking away from them 10 years earlier. That alone meant something had changed. I glanced toward the entrance of the courtyard again, half expecting to see the black sedan return to the street beyond. The alley remained empty. If they wanted confirmation tonight, they will not wait forever, I said quietly. Adrian folded his hands loosely in his coat pockets and leaned slightly against the brick wall beside him. No, he agreed. They will be watching for patterns, decisions, any signal that tells them where you stand. The faint smile he gave carried more understanding than humor. Which means every step we take now matters more than you realize. I crossed the courtyard slowly, stopping beneath the dim overhead light where the reflection of the skyline shimmered faintly in the puddle at my feet. For years I had followed instructions that arrived through anonymous channels, completing assignments that rarely revealed the full story behind them. Tonight was the first time someone connected the pieces directly in front of me. And you think they expect me to finish the contract anyway? I said. Adrian pushed away from the wall and stepped closer, his voice calm but deliberate. They expect you to prove your loyalty. The easiest way to do that is exactly what they asked for. The words hung between us. The meaning behind them was clear. I could still walk away from the courtyard, find another rooftop, and complete the mission exactly as the organization intended. That choice would restore the balance they expected. Adrian seemed to read the thought before I spoke. If you do that, he said quietly, the network remains exactly the same tomorrow as it was yesterday. Invisible, untouchable, untested. A distant siren echoed somewhere far across the city, fading quickly into the night. I looked up at him again. And if I do not? Adrian's expression remained calm, but something sharper appeared behind his eyes. Then the people who trained you will finally realize they created someone they cannot control anymore. The rain began falling again in a soft whisper across the courtyard. I took a slow breath and felt the weight of the decision settling around both of us. Adrian watched me carefully for a moment before speaking again in the same steady tone. Because once you make that choice, Scarlet, there will be no returning to the world you came from. The rain continued falling softly across the courtyard, turning the dim concrete into a mirror that reflected the broken shapes of the city lights beyond the rooftops. Adrian stood a few feet away from me, calm and patient, as if he had already accepted whatever decision would follow. I could hear the faint hum of traffic from the avenue nearby, the sound drifting between the narrow brick walls like a reminder that the world outside this moment was still moving forward. For years my life had been built on a simple system. Receive instructions. Complete the objective. Move on before questions had time to form. The network that trained me never encouraged curiosity. Curiosity created hesitation, and hesitation created mistakes. But tonight the rules had changed. I looked down at the reflection of the skyline in the shallow puddle near my feet, watching the distorted towers shimmer with every drop of rain. You said they are waiting for a signal, I said quietly. Adrian nodded once. Yes, something that confirms whether the mission continues as planned. The air between us felt different now, heavier with the understanding that the next decision would echo far beyond this alley. If the organization believed their system was still intact, they would remain hidden, confident that the structure they built could not be challenged. But if they sensed something unexpected, the entire balance could shift. I lifted my head slowly and met Adrian's eyes again. Then they should receive a signal, I said. Adrian watched me carefully, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. And what kind of signal do you plan to send? I stepped past him toward the entrance of the courtyard where the narrow street waited beyond the brick walls. The rain was lighter there, drifting through the glow of the streetlights like silver dust. The kind they will understand, I replied. Adrian followed a moment later, his footsteps quiet against the wet pavement as we returned to the sidewalk. The city felt different now, as if the night itself had noticed the change in direction. A few cars moved slowly along the avenue, their headlights stretching across the wet asphalt in long golden reflections. Adrian glanced toward the skyline before speaking again. Once this begins, there will be consequences, he said calmly. People inside that network do not respond well to uncertainty. I stopped beneath a streetlight and turned toward him. I am aware of that. Adrian studied my expression for a long moment before giving a faint nod of approval. Then the first move belongs to you. The quiet confidence in his voice carried an unexpected weight. For the first time since this strange night began, the path ahead felt less like a contract and more like a choice. I reached into my coat pocket and removed the small encrypted phone that had delivered the original assignment. The screen illuminated the darkness between us with a soft white glow. Adrian watched silently while I opened the secure channel used by the organization. They would already be monitoring it, waiting for confirmation that the operation had progressed exactly as they planned. My fingers hovered above the keyboard for a brief second before I typed a single message. Target located. Awaiting final confirmation. Relays, passing from one silent observer to another. Adrian watched the phone calmly in my hand, his expression thoughtful rather than tense. How long do you think they will take to respond? He asked. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked down the quiet avenue where the reflections of passing headlights slid across the rain-dark pavement. Not long, I said. They do not like unanswered questions. Adrian nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already predicted. The city around us continued its slow rhythm, a few late-night taxis passing the intersection while the wind pushed the last of the rain clouds across the sky above the buildings. It was strange how normal everything looked when the next move in a hidden war had already begun. A few minutes passed in silence before the phone vibrated again inside my coat. I removed it and glanced at the screen. A single new message had appeared through the secure channel. Read the words over my shoulder and exhaled slowly, almost amused by the predictability of it. Final confirmation, he repeated. The organization always enjoyed dramatic language. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked down the empty street. The meaning behind the message was unmistakable. They believed the mission had reached its final moment. Somewhere across the city, the people who had trained me were waiting for the last signal that would close the operation. Adrian watched me carefully as the silence stretched between us again. So now we reached the part of the night where the decision becomes real, he said quietly. I looked at him beneath the dim streetlight and felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the pavement shining beneath the city lights like a mirror waiting for the next move. The silence on the street felt heavier after Adrian's words. The message from the network still echoed in my mind. Proceed with final confirmation. The people who trained me believed the mission had reached its final moment, and somewhere behind encrypted screens they were waiting for proof that the system they built was still working exactly as it always had. Adrian stood beneath the streetlight across from me, calm and motionless, the pale glow outlining his silhouette against the dark buildings behind him. Contract closes. I looked up at him again. That is what they expect. Eliminate him. I slipped my hands back into my coat pockets and listened to the distant sounds of Manhattan waking slowly from its brief midnight pause. Somewhere far away a subway train rumbled beneath the streets. A siren echoed for a moment before fading into the distance. The city was moving again, unaware that a decision made on this quiet sidewalk was about to shift something much larger than either of us. Adrian studied me carefully before speaking again. When they receive your final signal, he said quietly, they will assume the operation is complete. Yes, I replied. That is exactly what they will believe. Adrian nodded slowly, understanding the implication immediately, followed his gaze toward the rising light over Manhattan. For most of my life, the path ahead had always been decided by someone else. A message,